Good morning, everyone. I'm Debbie Hart, the President and CEO of BioNJ, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this briefing on reference pricing and its unintended consequences. Unfortunately, this is a very timely discussion with the reintroduction of H.R. 3 at the federal level, as well as discussions on a prescription drug affordability board here in New Jersey. It's not an exaggeration to say that the research and development system that brought us COVID-19 vaccines in record time is under threat, along with the innovations of the smallest companies focused on rare and orphan diseases and, sadly, patient access to those drugs. H.R. 3 and the proposed Prescription Drug Affordability Board would use price controls to reduce drug pricing. But what we'll hear this morning is that these proposals are more likely to reduce the innovation that has brought treatments for conditions once thought untreatable in oncology, rare disease, Hep C, and many other therapeutic areas. And these proposals would undeniably reduce the ability of American patients to access cutting-edge therapies and treatments, much like what we see in European countries as a result of price controls there. Most importantly, there's little evidence that these proposals would address the goal of reducing patient out-of-pocket costs. So you may have seen the recent report by Vital Transformation, which shows the staggering impact of reference pricing on the life sciences continuum. We are very fortunate this morning to have the report's author with us who will share the findings. And it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Managing Director for Vital Transformation, Duane Schultes. Duane, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's fantastic. I'd like to thank you, Debbie and Randy and everybody from the team for allowing me this opportunity. It's been quite interesting, the impact of the study, and we're very gracious for everyone's support on this. Again, just to give you all a little bit of a background as to what exactly H.R. 3 and reference pricing is specifically. Essentially, what H.R. 3 does is it'll give you a target price of a weighted average of drugs within a certain amount of 6 benchmarked countries. And essentially what we're looking at are countries that include Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom. So the US under Medicare, and unfortunately for the rest of the commercial market, would no longer set their own prices. We would take the average price of this basket in H.R. 3, and then we would add another 20%. What it says is 120% of the AIM price, which sounds really fantastic. But actually what you're doing then is you're taking a 20% bump on the average price of these drugs. And what you'll see is in neurological disorders, for example, you're dropping close to 60%. So if you're at $100 a unit and you drop by 60%, you end up at $40 a unit. You add 20%, you're at $48 a unit. So you've actually dropped by over 50% from where you were. So it's actually not as great as it sounds. In fact, it's pretty devastating. The bill allows for 125 drugs from Part D as well as other drugs, 125 other drugs. So it can go up to 250, and it's not restricted to Medicare. This can go anywhere that HHS decides. It really is just based on net spending alone. And then price hikes are limited to inflation. Now, these days, hey, 5-6% a year, that's great. But inflation hasn't existed, so that I imagine if this bill comes out, that's probably going to go away. They'll probably put it to a hard number, but the idea was you wouldn't be able to increase by 5 or 6 or 10% a year. But given the fact that's where inflation's running right now, maybe that's not such a bad thing overall. And then essentially what you have is it's called the negotiated fair price. So this 120% benchmark, this AIM price, is actually the very best you will ever get according to the bill. In fact, the object of Health and Human Services and CMS is to negotiate the price that's to the lowest in the basket. So essentially, you're going to end up somewhere in between. Now, just to be clear here, we calculated everything based on the best case scenario. So we're looking at that 120% price for everything I'm going to quote from this point forward. So please bear in mind, this is the best as it's going to get. Now, what did we actually do? So what was the methodology here that we did, and what are the objectives? Well, we took a look at the bill's minimum criteria, and there is a minimal implementation. If the bill became law in its current form, there would be 25 drugs in year one and 50 drugs in year two. So we took that as our baseline, and we calculated that. It also, the bill calls for all insulin to be pulled out separately and calculated individually on their own. We assume this is under the same methodology. It's not actually terribly clear in the bill that that's the case, but we assume that that's the case. That'll be the same benchmarking exercise as the other drugs. And then we looked at a full implementation, which was the insulin plus 125 of the top spending drugs in Medicare Part B and D. Now, why do we only do 125? Because as you'll see, once you get above the 125th drug, the marginal impact is pretty nominal. I mean, basically, by the time you're at 50 drugs, you're at over $100 billion of impact on the sector per annum. So it's pretty devastating just with 50 drugs. And then you're just piling on, and the numbers don't actually get significantly worse. I mean, they do, but the huge hit is really with the first 50 drugs. And again, just to clarify, this will go for the entire commercial market. This is not limited to Medicare Part B and D. I know that there's been some comments in the press that that's the case. That is not the case according to the draft of the bill. All of these pricings will be allowed to all pharmaceutical benefit managers, as well as commercial group pricing and insurance. So this is basically becomes the commercial benchmark for insurance across the United States. And then what we do is we look at these revenue reductions, and we look back 10 years of how the industry has spent and invested in these revenues to develop new medicines and partnerships in an open innovation ecosystem approaches. And we say, okay, what would happen to those biotech investments? How would that be impacted? And that's what we do. So we look at that as well. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit just because there's a lot to go through, and I want to make sure we hit enough of everything, and I don't want to take all the time here. So is the EU a benchmark? I mean, obviously, we're looking at a lot of EU countries plus Australia and Japan and Canada. What does the EU do? So essentially, we're importing the EU's economics for health. Well, what does this mean? Well, if you look at what price ceilings are, and that's basically when you put a price ceiling in place, you're putting in a price that does not meet demand. Generally, governments feel, oh, stuff's too expensive, so we're going to put in a price ceiling. Well, what happens when you do that? That means your price does not meet the demand curve, and suppliers and manufacturers are not going to be able to produce to meet demand. They're going to be limited because they don't make enough money to meet the cost of demand. So essentially what this creates is an artificial supply shortage, and we've had numerous examples over history of this occurring. Obviously, the Soviet Union and Venezuela were two examples. Food lines, bread lines, the ubiquitous bread lines of those economies. That's an example of what happens when you put a price ceiling in that does not meet demand. There's a really excellent example, which is the 1973 oil embargo. OPEC had radically shot up the price of a barrel of oil in the United States in 1974 due to disagreement over policy. So more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess. What was intriguing here is Richard Nixon then decided to put a price freeze on a barrel, a price of a gallon of gas, basically, on the barrel. And it led to enormous gasoline shortages across the United States, across the whole country. And this actually happened. I remember we were driving across the United States from Wisconsin to California to move, and we got stuck in Colorado Springs for 6 days trying to wait for gas, a gas shipment. And fortunately, we had a trailer with us, and we slept in our own trailer, but there was really this state of Colorado was out of gas. Now, that's sort of probably a nice example and theoretical, but how does Europe handled their vaccine negotiations? They decided they were going to put in a maximal price ceiling of $12 a dose across all EU countries. And this was a group negotiation. And what has happened is, if you read this article in Politico, it's a really devastating article. And it shows that Europe really opted for price over access. And this has led to huge delays in vaccine deliveries in Europe. Now, they're trying to pick this up and change the strategy mid-course, and they're trying to get more volume. But if you look at the current rates of vaccination, for example, from March 1st, Israel was inoculating 1 1.1% of the population per day. The United Kingdom and the United States was doing about 0.5% per day. And Israel would be done in 91 days. If you look at this chart on the right, the US and the UK would be roughly 180 days or so. But if you look at Belgium and France and Italy, we're at 500 days. Germany, 500 days. Belgium, 800 days. Belgium right now, I think, is up to 25% of the population, and that's it. And that's 6 months. This is devastating. And this is an exact example of what happens when you put in price controls. Essentially, your only option, if you can't meet demand, is to limit supply and limit access. You ration. And that's what you've seen with the vaccines. Essentially, Belgium saved $120 million for paying $12 and not $24, the prevailing rate, to lose 30 billion in economic activity through their GDP, a 7% GDP loss in the year 2020. This is appalling, but that is the decision they made. They figured it was better to save short term and then take out debt. This is, fortunately, a consistency when you put in price ceilings. And we would see similar reactions to the U.S. healthcare system. We would have to ration. The U.S. system is not based upon rationing. We would have to import Europe's economics, essentially, if we do this. And again, just to point out, how would Europe respond to this? If you look at how companies, particularly in some of the discussions in Most Favored Nations and IPI, companies were trying to raise prices, and they were threatened with compulsory licenses by governments. And this is ongoing now with the IP waivers. Essentially, if you stand your ground in your negotiations as a single standalone company without the support of the US government, you get filleted by the local payer and you get held over a barrel. So the idea that you can unilaterally raise prices in Europe is something of a fallacy, because the governments are willing to even violate your own intellectual property, or at least threaten to, under the TRIPS regulations of the the World Trade Organization, the WTO regulations. This is legitimate and legal if you can declare a health emergency. And this is happening regularly in Europe. And again, as you can see as well, you have something called the hospital exemption. If you're doing gene therapies, CAR T therapies, any sort of human-derived stem cell tissue-based therapeutic regime, these things are allowed to go through a separate channel in Europe and be what's called exempted under the hospital exemption. You can produce them locally in a hospital without requiring direct EMA approval. This would be the equivalent of Vanderbilt University producing their own CAR T therapies without having to go to the FDA. Therapies are being cannibalized in the various countries in Europe without having to get correct compensation or regulatory approval. Tygenix, the former company headed by Eduardo Bravo, they had an autologous stem cell treatment that they tried to roll out. They got eaten alive by the hospital exemption, and so they switched their portfolio around completely and stopped doing autologous therapies and went to allogenic therapies, and then successfully exited. But the company was near bankrupt because you cannot do autologous therapies in Europe and not get cleaned up by the hospital exemption. And this is now a government strategy across all of the EU. And this is what they're doing with CAR T therapeutics. As well, what you see in Europe, this is a chart showing the evolution of the European biopharma sector. If you look, the amount of entities that came to research in the year 1961, you can see France and Germany eclipsed the totals of the United States. If you look at 1991 to the year 2000, this is no longer the case, and this evolution is getting worse. The US is dominating and basically sucking up a lot of the former activity that happened in Europe, and this basically correlates with the implementation of price controls in Europe. In fact, this is an excellent economic study that was done by Agar and Malik. This is quite well known. This was published in 2014, so it's a bit older. But again, this is getting quoted more and more frequently because essentially what they found in their activity is if you have more than a third of your sales exposure in Europe, in other words, the more activity you have in Europe, this is associated with lower R&D exposure globally. In other words, the more you're exposed to the European market operationally, the less efficient and the less R&D investments you will have. Europe, being exposed to Europe is bad for business. And what you're finding is then people are leaving. This is what Europe is doing now with their cost controls. And I cannot articulate this enough, and I cannot stress this enough. we run the serious risk of doing this in the United States if we follow these routes. So that's a bit of the background. Here's the reality. So as I mentioned, the first thing we did is we looked at the quote unquote minimal implementation of HR3, which was 25 drugs in year 1 and 50 drugs in year 2. And you can see here that we're looking at roughly 40% drops in net revenue in these asset classes in each year. Obviously, the target areas are oncology, rheumatology, neurology for the 25 drugs, and then we add immunology as well. By the time we get to the 50 drugs, you can see the classes here, and you can see the revenue drops here. Now, that's just for the drugs that here, even in the bare bones minimal implementation best case scenario, this is using the 120% margin assessment. So this is not the midpoint between the lowest price in the basket. This is what we're calling quote unquote the best case scenario. In the second year of the implementation, the 50 drugs, you're losing $100 billion a year, 102.3 billion euros in net revenue would be lost for the 50 firms that would be trapped in HR3. Now, for example, last year, 2020, the industry's net revenue for these companies, give or take, the bottom line, as it were, the EBIT, the earnings that would be declared in their shareholder value, was about 170 billion. So we're really talking, over 60, 50, 60% loss of net profit, net revenue. This is devastating, and this will have huge impacts. One of the most pernicious things about HR3 that really needs to be considered here, because you're only looking at price, and that's the only criterion. What is our net spend in Medicare Part D or B? It has nothing to do with the efficiency of the drugs. And again, we can go through Sovaldi. Yes, Sovaldi was $80,000, but it defrayed over time close to $200,000 per patient if you incorporated in not only the fact that the other drug was only 44% effective, the pegylated interferon, but also the fact that 1 in 5 patients who did not respond required a liver transplant. Those costs were close to $700,000 over the lifetime of the patient. So you're looking at, by the time you add all that up, you're looking at, $200,000 of expense per patient. So even though $80,000 looked really ugly on paper from a price standpoint, assessed allegedly, the fact is you were still saving $120,000 per patient. There was savings, and there was nowhere to recoup it. So if we're only looking at the cost per drug, it's really an arbitrary measure that does actually impact often the companies that have had the most innovative products. So if you focused on an injectable oncology, for example, that whole class of drugs is going to get hit. And this is a real problem. So you can see here, companies that have 4 or more assets are losing close to 10 billion in net revenue. 2 drugs, 2 billion, 1 drug, 1 billion. So it's additive. The more drugs you have, regardless of how good they are, you get penalized for being efficient and having drugs in demand. As well, the companies that have the most profit are the ones that get the most penalized. So we're sort of in many ways penalizing success, quote unquote, based on the market. So the top quartile of companies lose 121% of their net revenue, their net profit. So we're basically taking profitable companies and driving them into loss. And the top quartile gets really hammered. Now, if you look at this from the standpoint of 125 therapeutics, so the quote-unquote maximal implementation we did, you can see here 125 drugs leads to roughly 125 billion in lost revenue, 40% drop. Again, so we've gone from 50 drugs to 125. We've added 75 drugs to the first calculation, and we've only gone up 25 billion or so. So that's why I'm saying once we got to here, there was really no point going forward. Each individual marginal impact doesn't really justify the time or the expense of us doing the calculation. But you can see here that the results are quite huge. By the time you add an insulin, now we're up to 142 billion. So again, we're up to close to 150 billion. If you remember, I said last year was about 160, 170 billion in net revenue, net profit. So essentially, we're zeroing out the industry, or coming pretty close to it. Again, 8 drugs, 12 billion in net revenue loss. So again, we're just expanding the impact by the time we add that 125 drugs into the mix here. 4 drugs, 4 billion, 2 drugs, 2 billion, 1 drug, 1 billion, roughly. So again, it's additive. The more drugs you have that are impacted on your balance sheet, the more the impact will be per company. And again, we're spreading the wealth here a little bit as far as the pain. So the top quartiles, the two quartiles, so 50% of the companies will lose about 70% of their net profit in this analysis. So we're really collecting the pain here, and we're hitting a larger part of the sector as we add more and more of these drugs in. So that the peak is not as bad, but we're certainly bankrupting a larger part of the sector. What's intriguing is if you just look at this from the standpoint of an upper bound of where do the companies lose 95% of their net profit, their net earnings, and in either scenario we calculated roughly a third of the companies lose 95% or more. So potentially you're zeroing out a third of the companies in any scenario you run. Jobs, New Jersey is the second most important market we have in our analysis as far as jobs and impact. You can see here that New Jersey loses about 71,000 jobs on its own for the total ecosystem. The U.S. as a whole is losing close to 1 million jobs. Obviously, California is the largest. New Jersey and Massachusetts make out the 1, 2, and 3 in our analysis. So when you see that 132 billion annual revenue reductions or so, 125 drugs, you see that, this really does bite pretty hard across the country. So the ecosystem, as I mentioned, we wanted to look at the ecosystem impacts of this. So if the companies are making profits, which they do, increasingly they're reaching out and doing these partnership agreements with emerging biotech. And essentially the value chain, NIH comes up with a new technology, a small startup, nimble startup, starts developing that new technology, gets venture capital. They start partnering with Big Pharma, and then Big Pharma carries it over the finish line and takes it over phase 3. Big Pharma then supports these companies and helps them with expertise and invests into them and makes good with the venture capital and early stage mezzanine investors and the early initial public offerings. So what are you looking at here? You're looking at over the last 10 years, there were 215 of these deals, roughly $500 billion, $500 billion or so, 487 billion to be exact. And what we see then, if you reduce the net profits that we've seen, the available cash flow, you would be reducing these by a minimum of about 46%. So this would have a devastating impact, an absolutely devastating impact. Again, if we look at this, you'd see about 70% of these assets now are commercialized these ways in the United States, again, globally. So it's not just Pfizer and J&J and Gilead that are coming to New Jersey and buying a farm asset to acquire them and then produce that asset. No, it's Roche, it's GSK, it's Novartis, it's AstraZeneca. Everybody is coming to the US and playing in this market and working with these emerging technologies. And that's increasingly California, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. They really dominate, as we'll see. California is the largest in this and responsible for about a quarter of the cohort. And again, how dominant? Very, very, very dominant. I cannot stress this enough. The U.S., it's becoming so one-sided to be a rout. The U.S. really dominates in this space. Absolutely dominates in this space. It's not even close. And again, I can go through the numbers here deal by deal, company by company, and probably bore you all to death. I'm not going to do that, but you can see where New Jersey is. It's a close second to California. Massachusetts third. It falls off a little bit after Massachusetts. Here are the California deals. Here are the Mass deals. And again, I mentioned, Pharmasset, this was acquired by Gilead. This was where Sovaldi came from. And you can see $11 billion. This likely, these things would probably go away. And it's something we need to consider. Again, I'll deal with the economics here a little bit. We don't generally put a wet finger in the air and guess about this stuff. We like to build real models and analyze investor behavior. We have numerous studies that predict with a certain amount of accuracy that early stage investment is an excellent predictor of future peak sales. We've published our regression analysis to this matter in nonlinear regressions, exponential regressions, and numerous studies. This holds true pretty much every time we run the data. It's never failed us yet. It also is a very good model. A nonlinear logistic regression is a very good model to show how investors behave on market access. And you can see here, this axis here this is the amount invested. So that's 6 billion, 12 billion, 8 billion, 18 billion, 24 billion. These are the assets that did not come to market. And you see here, there's a high cluster of investments under $5 billion that didn't make it to market, particularly here, concentrate here, it's almost a black line. And then these are the 68 assets that did come to market in cumulative analysis and, skewing this way. And this red line shows the regression. Really strong p-value here. This shows that, we have less than a 1 in 10,000 probability that this statistical relationship is random chance. What does this say? What this says is to have a 50-50 probability to play in the pharma game, to work now with these assets, to sit at the poker table and ante up, and to have a 50-50 probability of putting an asset into approval. It requires about 5.2 billion of investments. Now, again, we're not making this up. These are based on real data, real investments. This is how that $500 billion was spent. It takes, if you can't put up 5 billion, now that's not to say if you don't put up 5 billion, there's not a probability. It's less likely, significantly less likely. And we see a high statistical probability that the more you're investing and the more you're putting in, the higher probability of market entry. But to play the game and have a 50-50 probability, it takes about $5.2 billion. So because this is statistically significant, it allows us then to run these numbers and take the logit function, what's called the logit function, which is how this works. And then we can start extracting money and lower the probabilities based on what happens when you start sucking money out of the market. Well, this is a good example here. If you look at liver cancer and cardiovascular disease, liver cancer just peaks up at 51% probability. So that's, even when you lower the revenues, there's a high likelihood given investor behavior that, yeah, this would still probably stick. But what do you see here? Cardiovascular disease, 73% to 49. At this point, we start seeing that investors, the risk-reward ratio gets a little light. And investors, because of the reduced liquidity, investors are going to start fleeing the market. If you're reducing liquidity by 50%, you don't get 50% less drugs. And I need to stress this. Yes, we have had a situation where very unlikely and improbable drugs have come to market, but that is because the market has been subsidizing those drugs. For 100 drugs, 10% are the only ones that are profitable, and they subsidize the other 90. And those other 90 are really important because a lot of those are rare diseases, orphan drugs. They're things that are really important. So without that money, it's really important to keep in mind that we need that support from the blockbusters. Those other drugs are going to go away. The money is not going to be there. So if you lose 50% of the revenue, you're going to lose 80%, 70%, 90% of the drugs. That's the point. And the more revenue you lose, the less likely, the higher the improbability, I need to stress that, the less likelihood there are for these other drugs to come to market because the revenue is not there to support the market. And there will be more competition for the more likely assets that will drive a return on investment. And this is the key. We can predict investor behavior. Investors are logical. They chase revenue. Again, these are the assets that don't come to market. I'm not going to bore you to death with this. You can look through this. This is downloadable on our website. Again, we looked at California. California, again, was responsible for roughly a quarter, 17 of the drugs. California probably drops to 1 by the time you get all the revenue out. Now, quickly, I'd like to talk about the NIH just for a couple minutes here, because there's an idea that the NIH could then pick up the slack and do drug discovery. We didn't see that, and we don't see that. We looked at 23,000 NIH grants in 6 areas of funding for the NIH: National Cancer Institute, National Heart and Lung, National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Disease, Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Skin Diseases, Diabetes, and Neurological Disorders. Now, this is going back to the year 2000 because we know it takes 20 years or so for a drug. Once it's initially had its first publication, it takes about 20 years or so to come to market. So from the year 2000, we looked at 23,000 grants. We found 8,226 Bi-Dole patents that were filed, because this was pretty close to after Bi-Dole had become law and you could patent NIH technology and make that commercializable. So we found 8,226 patents that were created from this research. From those traces of those 8,000 patents or so, we found 41 products that entered clinical research. We then searched every single patent in those 41 products and found 511 patents that were associated to NIH research. And from those 511 patents and 41 products, we found 18 that came to market. So how do the revenues work on those products? Well, for the 18 products that came to market, the private sector put 44 billion in, and the NIH put 670 million in. Again, I'll say that again. So where we see the private sector coming to bat with these assets, it's to the tune of 44 billion from these 18 assets that came to market. And the NIH total contribution of those 18 assets was 670 million. You can see here the 18 products. There's one product here that was a late stage acquisition before market access. So 22 billion to 1 billion, but product 2, 8 million to 8 billion. So we're talking, 100 times the amount, 1,000 times the amount, 100 times the amount, sorry. Product 3, 8 to 3 billion, 5 billion to 1 billion. So we're talking real huge skews in the amount that the private sector funds compared to the NIH. And again, we can look at this by the clinical area: oncology, neurology, endocrinology. Again, still 5 million to 5 billion for oncology, 100 million to 2 billion for neurology. You can see the skew basically holds. What's intriguing and one of the most interesting findings I'll present to you all day now, what we found is it's a lot of the criticism on the industry is that you're just skimming the cream off the NIH and capitalizing on something that would have come to market anyway. We don't see that. If you look at the 41 assets in total, and particularly the 23 that did not come to market, what do you find? You find that there's really a big punt being played by the private sector. 3 billion to 500 million in total for the assets in phase 2 to test them out and see if they have market credibility and viability. And you can see that, there's a real heavy investment being made in the industry, even in those assets that didn't make it in, to test and see if they're viable. We just don't see stuff being left on the shelf, laying fallow in some grand conspiracy theory. We just don't. I mean, the fact is the private sector is testing everything out possible to see if there's market potential there. And again, this goes back to my earlier point where 10% of the drugs are really driving the total market sector. You can see here of the 18 assets we looked at, obviously the one that just came to market in October, we're not going to look for peak sales there because it's just too early days. But if you look here, I mean, really, there's 4 billion. There's 3 assets that are essentially blockbusters, and then a bunch of other stuff that, really most of the stuff from the 79 million here, 4 of the drugs didn't show any revenue at all. And then, these drugs here, most of these aren't making money. So essentially it's these 3 or 4 here that are subsidizing the entire pipeline. And this, again, is really important. What does this chart show? Again, I know this is statistical and I hate to bore people, but it's really important because this is real evidence. What this shows is private funding is a percentage of the total mix. Obviously, there's always a certain percentage of NIH funding because that's our selection bias. We're saying there is NIH funding. That is our given. What we're saying is if there's 0% private funding in the mix, so if it's 100% funded by the NIH, there's literally a 0% probability of that asset coming to market. 0%. What you see here is as we get over 90% and approach 100%, we're getting close to 60% probability. So the more into the market the private sector is, the more active and fully invested they are into that asset, the more likely it is for that asset to come to market. In other words, without the private market, statistically, there is 0 statistical probability that this asset will come to market. It is the private sector overwhelmingly that is driving NIH assets to market. Now, I could go on. I'm not going to. There's a lot there to chew on. I'm going to stop and let you ask me all sorts of questions. And please, I feel free. I look forward to your questions, and I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to present.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dwayne. You've been busy, 2 really important studies that you released just in the last couple of months. And I know we've been keeping you busy as you're sharing your story and making sure that we understand it and that our community understands it. So thank you so much. And, the numbers just don't lie, right? All that data, while you might, you've as you said it, perhaps it was boring. It's not. I think it's compelling anyway. So, if we could take a little bit of a deeper dive, and I invite anyone who has a question for Dwayne, please type it in the chat box, and we're in the Q&A. Either way, we'll get to you. And thank you so much. So just to kick us off. So when we hear the stories of countries like Belgium, how are they, do they get it? Do they see the numbers don't lie? So how do they rationalize their practices?
For years, I've been showing data, the biotech data about the bleed of biotech and IP out of Europe to the United States, how dominant the US is. And until recently, I thought this is very compelling. Obviously, this is problematic. And finally, I've had a couple members of the industry who shall remain nameless. One of them is a very well-known lobbyist in Brussels, a friend of mine, very good person, who told me, Dwayne, I used to work for the telephone sector. in Europe. I used to work for the semiconductor sector, and Europe lost them both. There was nothing to stop them from losing the pharmaceutical sector. At a certain point, I just don't think they care about industrial policy related pharmaceuticals. Everything they're doing, all they care is short-termism and cost. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, and I hate to be the cynical, but I don't think as the industry has less and less exposure in Europe, as Novartis, I mean, the only two, well, I shouldn't say that. Bayer is still a player. Obviously, Sanofi is still a very prominent player, particularly since their acquisition of Genzyme. But unfortunately, as there's less and less of a footprint, pharmaceutical and biotech footprint in Europe, there's less and less political loss to criticize the industry. And in fact, it's very popular to criticize the pharmaceutical sector. And I don't think anybody would lose an election by, for example, the Pfizer vaccine, for saying we're just going to steal the IP, where that's why they're pushing for IP waivers so much, because they don't care about the next cancer cure. That's an mRNA vaccine that would potentially give it to the Chinese for free and kill our economy. They just don't care that way because they don't have the exposure. Germany does, and which is why the only European country that's spoken out about IP waivers was Germany. I don't think that's a mystery. Unfortunately, I think that increasingly they don't care about the late stage value creation of pharmaceuticals. They see it as a cost and an overhead only because of the way they budget their healthcare. And the reality is, I don't see this getting any better anytime soon. Unfortunately, I think it's going to get worse, particularly as the over 80 population in Europe by 2060 will be over 20% of the net population. And there will be only 2 workers for every 1 pensioner by 2060 as well. The economics of Europe are devastating to the healthcare system.
Okay. So puts more pressure, obviously, on the U.S. So
I wish I had a better news to deliver about that.
Thank you. Meanwhile, we asked you to take a look at the Prescription Drug Affordability Board legislation here in New Jersey. So we'd love your thoughts on the potential impact of that.
Yeah, again, we have not run the hard numbers on it looking at the proposal, but I have to say the proposal is bereft of hard numbers, if I could be diplomatic here. Essentially, it puts there's 5 appointed people who have a panel of appointed people who then decide that when a drug is over $30,000, that's too much money, and then they're going to do something. What we don't know, they're going to run a study, and then some magic's going to happen, and then those prices, I guess, are mysteriously going to get lower somehow. So essentially, the upper bound is $30,000 in total cost, or over $3,000 of a price rise annual per annum. It seems rather arbitrary, and again, I can only preface this where, if you look at that chart, if you remember that chart I showed by Damerich from Harvard, looking at the long-term macroeconomic impact of these decisions in Europe, price controls are devastating to the economy. New Jersey is the 2nd or 3rd largest biopharma economy, depending on how you spin it and slice it. According to our research, it falls in 2nd or 3rd, depending on what the metrics are. You've had great success putting out very, very high value drugs that are treating and curing people of really important diseases like hepatitis C, which, by some of the patents expire in 2028, then it becomes a public good and it's free. I really get very concerned when I see these political decisions being made without economic thought. It does concern me because you can't take away economic reality. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And to quote, at the risk of quoting Thomas Sowell, the economist, there are no good and bad, there are just trade-offs. There will be trade-offs, and the trade-offs will be less of a biopharmaceutical sector. That is just the reality. I don't know the exact numbers, but I guarantee that will occur.
Okay. Well, thank you. It seems that obviously, you talked about a range of companies that will be affected. At risk in a very large way are the rare disease drugs, the small early stage companies. Can you talk a little bit about that, the effect and then why that is?
I mean, right now, sorry, Debbie. Right now, you're looking about 70 million, 60 million for the average rare disease asset in revenue, net revenue, give or take, depending on the asset. The overwhelming of, I did an interview with Jack Scannell, the great analyst, which will be coming out in our podcast. And just to front run something he said, we were talking about orphan drugs and rare diseases. Well, all drugs, there's only a 10% that really make money. The thing is, it's magnified somewhat in rare diseases because you're dealing with smaller and smaller indications. It means higher risk for the investor. And if you start cutting the revenue potential of this asset class, all that stuff goes away just because it's hard to justify the revenue and expense because the revenue just isn't there to support the investment risk. If you look at this just from a pure nuts and bolts standpoint, right now, today, 80% of all orphan drugs produced that are off patent in Europe and the United States do not have a generic competitor. No, it's just the fact is the markets are too small even to justify having more than one producer. These are very, very niche indications. And if you start, and again, they're vital, they're important. They're treating people who have a rare condition. In some cases, these are the only things that are keeping them alive. If you start putting those things at risk from a revenue standpoint, it's going to be hard for an investor to justify that risk. Right now, okay, we do it because there's a revenue potential there. There's tractability. They come to market a bit quicker on average. We did a Pearson chi-square regression on orphan drugs. We looked at the average mean, and we came to the conclusion that on average, they come to market about 3 years earlier. The reason why they can do that is because there's tractability and availability of liquidity to fund them. All this goes away. So those markets just disappear. Despite the, I usually use Alzheimer's as my bête noire to beat up, but yes, we did have an approval, but obviously it's quite controversial. That said, there's been so many failures in Alzheimer's drugs. The idea that you're going to risk 300 investments in an asset class without having an approval or one approval seems highly unlikely going forward. That's the reality. The numbers just look really ugly when you start reducing these things by 50, 60% of net profit. It gets really hard to make the numbers work.
So thank you for that. And, you mentioned in your remarks, and I'd ask you to maybe if you could take a little bit of a deeper dive, the Pharmasset story. So Pharmasset was developed right here in New Jersey in Princeton, what is now where BioLabs is situated. It was acquired by Gilead. The way the industry works is then Gilead came back just last year and acquired Immunomedics. So now they have a large presence here in New Jersey. Basically the cure for Hep C as a result of the Pharmasset acquisition. So clearly a huge impact on the New Jersey economy and clearly a huge impact on patients. Which will continue, for years to come. So, can you, if you would, just review that Sovaldi story again and the numbers and, because they took a large hit in the beginning in terms of the optics, but the reality is that it's a very effective drug that reduces the cost to the healthcare system over time.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? We had an internet dropout. Sorry about that. Welcome to Zoom. Gilead got beat up a bit at the beginning. It's interesting because, we at our firm, we don't, read the bumper sticker slogans. We look at the math and say, okay, what's going on? 80,000 looked eye-popping when it was released, sure. But then we started looking at the alternative pathway, the pegylated interferon treatments. And what you find very quickly is pegylated interferon was about 40,000, 45,000, a treatment path. Interferon was a pretty tough drug to take. A lot of people just couldn't take it. It's pretty aggressive, has a high amount of adverse events. The AE ratio is pretty tough. But yet, safe, effective, yes, but some people don't tolerate it terribly well. What you found was only 44% of the population was responding. So if you take a $45,000 cost, you times that by 50%, or divide it by 50%, you're at $90,000 for an equivalent cure. Just right there. Already, Sovaldi at $80,000 is $10,000 a treatment cheaper. Assuming anybody on the planet was paying $80,000, most weren't. They were already getting a discount off the retail price. Now, obviously, we don't know what that was. That's negotiated. But the reality is that no one was paying $80,000. So already, just on surface cost, it's cheaper by about 10 grand, and it's twice as effective. So, already it's hard to argue the economics there, just straight up. Now, by 2014, AbbVie had produced their combo therapy. Now, it wasn't as effective, admittedly so. J&J also had a very effective combo therapy, another New Jersey company, I should add. They also had a very effective therapy for Hep C. So you had three companies coming to market. AbbVie came in first in competition with Sovaldi. Gilead lowered the price to meet the price of AbbVie. So you're now around 45, 50,000. At that point, the economics are really good and it's very, very effective, particularly when compared to the alternative pathway. But no one also then looked at the risk for what happened to that 56% of the population on pegylated interferon who then didn't respond. The over other 50% that then had an adverse event or didn't respond to the treatment. Well, you find that 1 in 5 of them over 10 years would require a liver transplant, would develop pre-cancer or liver cancer, or would have a complete failure. And all of a sudden, now you're talking a $700,000 treatment with tacrolimus, anti-rejection drugs per month, and all these other things that creep in, and even in the most rose-colored scenario, using a 3% cost of capital, you're down around another $70,000, $80,000 by the time you discount that per patient. Now you're looking at $170,000 to $200,000 per patient against that $80,000. The problem is, and this is where it gets a little tricky, is that's a hospital treatment in a hospital that then would fall under, if we're just looking strictly at Medicare, that's a Medicare Part B treatment. Has nothing to do with Part D, which is where Sovaldi lives. That's a pill. Our system just doesn't deal well with the idea that you can take a Medicare Part B savings and then transfer it to Part D. It doesn't deal well with 10 years from now, there's going to be a defrayed hospital cost from a liver transplant that no longer needs to occur. The problem is we just have no way intellectually and systemically to manage the way moving these costs around. Now, within an HMO, it's theoretically possible. But again, if you're dealing with outside group insurance and things, or particularly with government insurance through Medicare, these things get really difficult politically. So the problem is, yes, it makes sense. It absolutely makes sense economically, but it still, unfortunately, with our current system, doesn't help that payer who's got a sick fund in 1 year and a limited budget, and that's what they have to deal with. And this is the problem. This is where, in a certain sense, the former liver transplant team becomes a rent seeker because they're getting huge savings in the hospital that are being realized and subsidized up here at the front end by the person paying for the drug. Ideally, in a perfect world, there's a way to transfer those costs around, but unfortunately, we just don't have those systems right now.
Okay. Well, we have some work to do for sure. Thank you. So, as we look at communicating this message and getting this information out, right? And we have clearly very limited time to share information with folks. I mean, this is a luxury, right? Having almost an hour of everyone's time this morning. So how exactly do you for the bumper sticker, or how do you tell the story in a succinct way that the bottom line is less innovation and fewer jobs and patients will die?
Well, I think HR3, you will have less drugs and less innovation. I think that's the bottom line, and that's reality. You will have less patient access. You will have less medicines. You will kill biotech innovation, period, full stop. You can pick any one of those. They're all true. Now, the reality is, do people care? I would hope people would care. I would hope that people with Parkinson's disease would care. I would hope that people with Duchenne muscular dystrophy would care. I would hope people who don't have that would care about people who have that. Unfortunately, we have a bigger thy neighbor approach here, and I'm in Washington today. I've got a bunch of meetings, and we're developing a bigger thy neighbor approach to politics, which is really unfortunate. I can understand completely my father's an entrepreneur he has a thyroid issue and he has to take a very expensive thyroid medication. And he gets very upset, even though he's an investor and a very successful investor and entrepreneur. Why is this drug more expensive here than it is in Canada? I get that. I totally get that. And it's a viable argument. And ideally, we would be doing something to deal with that. I don't think forcing the drug company to try and raise prices in Canada is going to be a winning formula. I just don't. I ultimately, where this has to live is in trade agreements. We wouldn't expect this, when Boeing and Airbus get into a fight, it's not Boeing fighting, it's the US government, supporting these trade agreements. This is what needs to happen. This needs to be an issue of trade. This needs to be discussed at the administrative level, because there's no way you're going to get this through. So yeah, until then, the bumper sticker slogan is, we're going to get less drugs, people will have less access, you're going to kill innovation. Pick any one of those three. The reality is, fixing it, that's going to require a coordinated effort by our administrative betters. And unfortunately, I don't know if I see any appetite to do that right now, which I think is, given the IP waiver discussion, is rather unfortunate.
Well, we can only hope, and obviously work hard to educate folks. So just Dwayne, we have a question in the chat. So how did you arrive at the potential loss of jobs, the numbers for New Jersey?
Yeah, this is another health economic firm did work for pharma based on a forced reduction. This was related to MFN and IPI, some earlier assessments from a couple of years ago, and they went 50 billion and 100 billion in their Techonomy is the name of the company. So we took their data and extrapolated it up based on the increased number of revenue reduction. So that's how the number is. It's using their model. And again, we state that very clearly in the data. It's the one chart that we have that wasn't ours. And again, it's based on their model. So we're assuming, and we do to put a disclaimer, this is Techonomy model, blah blah blah. So that's where that data comes from. It's a pharma study. But again, we scaled it up based on the increase in revenue impacts.
Okay, perfect. So let's see. So another question in the chat: do you have a one-page executive summary that could be shared with key opinion leaders and elected officials? And I know we've developed one in New Jersey ourselves, but love to hear anything that you might suggest, Dwayne.
Well, if you look at pharma obviously has one from their website. If you can go to the pharma website and link through. They have an exec summary. We can send that link around. I'm sure we can dig it up, but we have access to it as well. If you go to our website, vitaltransformation.com, and click on the deck, both the NIH study and the HR3 study have executive summary slides, bullet points, very clear to read out. Boom, boom, boom. Very clear language. So if that's the way you want to go, if in a PowerPoint style, you can do that. Pharma did a big press release talking about the notes. That's also linked on our website too. So there are a couple ways you can get some cursory, tight information that will help your cause.
Terrific. Okay, thank you. And help those, are the policymakers on the line to, to better educate them, and then also their colleagues if helpful. So Dwayne, any parting thoughts? We're just about out of time.
Sure.
Love to hear your final thoughts, please.
Well, I think the thing that concerns me most is there's so much political hay you can rake with this issue, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. It's quite popular because it wins votes. I get very concerned about extremely complex issues that are boiled down to a bumper sticker, things like Green New Deal, Build Back Better. Things like that always make me shudder a little bit, because there's the devil's in the details here, and it scares me, because I think someone is going to be behind in the polls and is going to try and make hay both in 2022 and 2024. I don't need to stress this, but I will quickly. We weren't even supposed to look at HR3. We were only supposed to look at MFN. So our initial analysis was only supposed to touch on most favored nations. Now, fortunately, cooler has prevailed, and we said, look, this is not going to stop at MFN. And I got to thank my partner, Joe Hamming, and certainly Robert Pafoli, who's also on the line, for fighting this fight, a rearguard action with some of the clients to say, look, you got to do both of these, because this is going to rear its ugly head. The focus was on most favored nations, the executive order of the Trump administration, and I should stress this to everybody on the call, that became a law. Okay, this was law, ladies and gentlemen. What we're looking at in HR3 was in law in most favored nations, and most favored nations did put into law that it was the lowest price in the basket. We were looking at 70 or 80% revenue reductions in most favored nations. Now, that study has not been public. It was submitted as part of the court case and the court injunction for MFN that was brought by California Life Sciences Association and Bio, and has successfully put an injunction against that terrible bill. But the reality is that became law. That passed, and that was in place for a month. Now, it didn't get acted on and it was stopped, but I don't think people realize how close this stuff came to actually happening. And there's nothing to say that another executive order, if 2022 is not looking good for the House for the Democrat side, or if there's some Republicans who feel that they can make hay in the Senate and get a bigger majority, I'm not convinced that either things are not going to happen, that we're either going to see some legislation or an executive order similar to this. We have to be really careful about this, folks. This is not going away anytime soon.
Okay, well, Dwayne, thank you for that sobering news, but you're just really tremendous insights, and your amazing intellect. We really appreciate you sharing all of that with our audience.
Well, I
today.
wouldn't go that far, Debbie, but thank you very much. I mean, I need to say as well, we have a great team, a fantastic team at VT. Dr. Harry Bowen, our consulting economist, University of North Carolina, formerly of Valeric School. He's a brilliant man, done wonderful work in econometric international business analysis. Joe and Robert as well are great teammates, and Augie, who did work for us, did a lot of the data collection, and Gergana. We got a great team, so it's not just me. Please, I talk the most and the most fast, so that's all.
Well, you do it well. Thank you so much, Dwayne, and take care. Stay well, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and obviously call us at BioNJ if we can answer any of your questions or support your conversations on this really critically important issue to New Jersey and most importantly to patients. Take care. Thank you again.